Hi guys, welcome back to Too Many Cooks with me, Charles Burns. And today I'm delighted to have Dr. Shan Hussain with me. I pronounced your name correctly there?
Shan, yes.
Shan Hussain. And Shan is, of all accounts, an NHS GP, if I'm not mistaken. So I'm sure we will inevitably come on a little bit to talk about the current situation with COVID-19, coronavirus, and but I think there's a lot of other stuff that you talk about that's actually probably very relevant for right now that's also worth kind of mentioning. So yeah, be looking forward to this conversation, to be honest with you. I guess kind of starting at the beginning, you studied in Imperial College Medicine in '94. What led you on to wanting to be a doctor? Was it something you'd always grown up and thought, I want to do this? Was it your parents had kind of sent you down that vocation? Like, how did that come about?
Yeah, great question, actually. I haven't been asked that before. Yes, family of two Indian immigrants growing up in the UK with little imagination. I ended up going to medical school. But no, there's a bit more to it than that. I did have an interest in those specific fields that took us towards medicine, biology, chemistry, maths, and physics. From a long line of doctors, my dad was a consultant anaesthetist in chronic pain relief. And I just kind of find myself drifting that way. And I have to say, during the actual education through medical school, I did not really enjoy it at all. I didn't really like the structure, the system, the place, and even a lot of the students. But I kind of grew to enjoy the actual role that we do as doctors, you know, when we're meeting people and we're helping them to make a difference in their lives, whether it's, you know, through discussions, counseling, conversations, treatments, interventions or referrals, whatever it is we end up doing with them. So that's really what kept me in the role, and still do to this day.
It's interesting because I was chatting to another doctor. He's I think he's actually in like a hospital type setting, and he was talking about the fact that the actual way in which you're taught, as one would imagine at a university, versus the reality of the actual role are so different. And actually it's almost like, yeah, I've got this theory, but now I need to understand, how do I deliver information to a patient? How do I operate, you know, simple things like he was talking about drugs charts and, like, you know, all these kind of physical things you have to get used to. And he said that was one of the most difficult parts for him coming out of the kind of education system. Was it similar for yourself?
Yes, 100% agree. One of the things I often say is that medical school doesn't teach you how to be a doctor. You learn how to be a doctor by hanging out with and learning from other brilliant doctors who are willing to take you under their wing. And yes, the first day when you're let loose on the wards, which for me was back in 2000, beginning of 2000, it was terrifying. I did not know what I was doing. And you know, you try and revert to your education and your experience, and you just realize that it's very, very far removed from what the day-to-day job is. So yes, that's really where the learning starts. It doesn't happen so much in medical school, but actually on the wards. And an old saying that you don't learn how to be a doctor by studying in the library. You learn how to be a doctor at the bedside.
And so
patients.
I mean, someone like myself that's, you know, can only obviously been to a doctor, thankfully, very, very seldomly, but I just think about like that first day, that first week, that first month in any job, right, is difficult, because particularly when it's new, you think, you know, you firstly think you know what you're doing, then you realize, you know, you've got uninformed optimism and you need to learn this whole new set of skills. But I imagine that's no more true than the doctor setting. Can you recall your first month, week, year, that kind of thing? The feeling, did you feel sometimes like that almost imposter syndrome, like, why am I here? Or did you always have that kind of confidence that even though it was maybe the first time you've seen a patient in real life with certain symptoms or in certain scenarios, were you just confident because you thought, I have to be, I owe the duty of care to the patient? How does that relationship work?
Well, there were times when I was confident, but looking back, it was probably more to do with arrogance. I found that I did not really. There were times when I was absolutely terrified, and what really got me through it was the peer group I was with, because it was old school in those days. All the junior doctors lived on site. We had free accommodation, and all of our bills were paid, which was just wonderful.
Wow.
And we looked out for each other. We took care of each other, and we made sure that we were feeling supported. So I think that's really what helped more than anything else. But yes, as time went by, your confidence kind of built and grew, and we'd be able to find ourselves working a lot more independently.
And I guess the practice has changed considerably over the years in terms of the sorts of things people come in with now. Do you see, as is the kind of the current zeitgeist of mental health, is that over the last couple of years from you, is it noticeable you're seeing more of those kind of patients, or has it always been there and it's just being talked about more, do you think?
It's certainly being talked about more, which is wonderful. I think it's a long overdue conversation. Mental health, I mean, yes, it's always been there. And I've been a GP since 2007, and we have seen a lot of mental health problems increase over that time. We as doctors took it just as seriously then. And what's great is that there's now an increasing national conversation about the importance of recognizing it, how we shouldn't assume that someone saying they're depressed, just because we can't visibly see that, or if we see certain behaviors that don't immediately fall in line with what we perceive as depression, then it's quite easy to unfortunately dismiss it. And it's great that that seems to be working its way out of our thinking, and it's not particularly helpful for the patient to have that kind of false perception. So yes, mental health, I'd say yes, there is a higher prevalence of mental health problems, and certainly with what we've got going on in the world right now, we're seeing more of it as well. People are really struggling at times, and it's important that we look at how we can support them, not just medically, but also at a community level.
And that's just quite a nice segue, because one of the things I know you're very kind of passionate about is all about like holistic health, and how diet is a big part of this, and plant-based particularly. Has that always been the case in your mind since when you started, or is it something that has become more noticed now by yourself, that diet and the holistic view of health is now talked about more? Was it beforehand you were almost trying to like, solve problems, rather than, whereas now you're looking at kind of how can we prevent these happening in the future?
It's something that's progressed over time with me. When I obviously came out of medical school, all I knew was medicine. What do we see and how do we treat it? What pills are we going to go for? Or what intervention or what procedure does this person need? Instead of really starting to understand the bigger picture, what's going on in their life that's contributed to this illness. And that's what got me interested in that side of things. I noticed that as I was working, we were seeing more and more patients with chronic conditions. We were seeing an increase in type 2 diabetes, in obesity, in heart disease, in strokes, in cancers. And it made me think, well, why is this happening? Why are we finding ourselves more and more, people are being more succumbing to these illnesses? And that's really what got me interested in looking in this whole area of beyond health, beyond medicine, and into broader health. Why do some people live to be 110 and other people die at 30 through no clear fault of their own? So there's got to be things that we're doing within our diet or our lifestyle. And from what I found, it really comes back, very broadly speaking, to two things, and that is our diet and our stress levels, or more specifically, how we respond to stress. And if we can do our best to optimize both of those, and do our best to reduce the effect it can have on our constitution, then theoretically we can live longer, healthier, and hopefully happier lives.
So when you talk about diet, are you personally, are you plant-based? Are you moving towards that? Are you suggesting that your wider patients do so? What's your kind of thinking on that?
Well, it's interesting that you, excuse me, that you use the words plant-based, because that's actually fairly recent. The word vegan became very, very popular about a year and a half ago, after a rather flawed study in The Lancet, which supposedly determined what we should and shouldn't be eating. I'm not vegan or plant-based. There are actually a number of benefits that we find from eating animal products, and this makes me somewhat at odds with a lot of what people are saying nowadays. But the truth is, a diet that is purely plant-based does not have all of the nutrients that we need to sustain ourselves in the optimal balance. You'll find yourself deficient of a lot of important vitamins, minerals, things like B12, choline, etc. And thus it's important that if people are on such diets, which is fine, I'm not judging them or telling them they're wrong, that's purely a personal choice. It's important to make sure they're getting whatever supplements they need. But in terms of this big plant-based movement and going vegan, I think that it seems to have been pushed quite aggressively. And if you really look into it very carefully, in fact, a number of my friends have talked very vocally about this, it's actually been driven by certain industries who have a vested interest in people turning to plant-based food and away from animal products. That perhaps is a conversation for another time, but there are a number of people out there who can provide a very factual information about this movement. Dr. Aseem Malhotra, Nina Teicholz, Malcolm Kendrick, David Unwin, all of them very well read in this area. And if you really look at their work and how they've dissected it meticulously, it becomes increasingly suspicious, this whole movement about going plant-based. And in all honesty, if you're getting a good, healthy cut of meat or whatever animal-based product you like, so long it's in the process of how it's made. So if it's a packaged or a processed meat, obviously it's not good for you. Similarly, if you've got a packaged or processed vegetable, it's not going to be terribly good for us. It really comes back to the actual quality of the food and what macronutrients are in there, and are they going to be able to sustain our bodies. So that's really my approach at this time.
Certainly, some of those names I'll have to look into. It's something that I'm kind of exploring myself personally from a weight perspective. I was looking to lose weight and just thought it was in the beginning of the year, I thought I'll see how the kind of general plant-based, what it does to me personally. I eat chicken. I'm not against eating meat necessarily, but just haven't been eating it. I've eaten chicken on kind of Friday nights from a religious standpoint. And it's easy for my mum, to be honest. But I've lost like a stone, and I've not really changed much in my exercise. So I don't know that's how much is that down to the diet. I'm not sure, but so far so good. So I will I'll read up more and kind of see what I think, I suppose. I know as well you've got kind of like two, I suppose you could call them stated aims that you have. One being supporting natural health and reducing medication. We've talked a little bit about that, but what outside of diet, what are you talking about when you're saying to support natural health? What does that mean to you?
Well, a lot of the medications that we end up prescribing tend to be last resorts, and we should only really be prescribing something if all else has failed. And that's what I want to really sort of open up with. You know, if someone has type 2 diabetes, depending on who you speak to, Professor Tim Noakes I spoke to recently says that there's absolutely no reason why a type 2 diabetic can come off all of their medications if they adopt the right approach towards diet. And I think these are the key things that we need to come across. Now, it's not for me to sit here and tell people what they should and shouldn't eat. That's not my job. I don't want to tell anyone how to live their life. What's important is helping people understand the options and understand what's going on, why they're feeling like this, what has brought them to where they are now, and what can simply be done to change it. You know, just 2 or 3 simple steps within their lifestyle or their diet can absolutely transform their health if that's what they want to do. So yes, I mean, we're living in a time now where we're certainly over-medicating. I don't think there's any doctor out there who would dispute that. And all the medications, every single one of them has potential side effects, including something simple like paracetamol. And so it's important that we do what we can to deprescribe as doctors. That should be a key part of our role, and make sure that we're not putting people on too many medications. It's interesting because I met a chap who I spoke to for my podcast who studied medicine back in the 70s. And back then there was a rule in place that he learned in medical school, which was that no patient should ever be on 6 tablets or more. Now, 6 tablets to the average person does sound like a lot. But in actual fact, we as doctors, we see people on 20 tablets at times, sometimes even more than that. And, balancing all of the potential interactions and looking at the side effect profile and all of the damage that could be happening as a result, we've really got to think about how we can better manage in these situations, how we can better support our patients. And, if they want to come off their medications and look for a more natural approach to doing that. That is, just to be clear, evidence-based and scientific and proven. So it's not something that we recommend people do without taking specialist advice in these situations. But yes, I do think that we're reaching a point where we are over-prescribing and over-medicating, and that can't really be a good thing. That's not how we were designed.
Yeah, it's interesting because I've got a lot of friends over in the United States, and for many, many years I've seen it there where if you'd not prescribe something, you're almost seen as odd and unusual. Like,
Mhm.
I've got friends that will take a Xanax for an airplane flight, and then they'll take something else to put them back up, and they'll take something. I'm like, whoa, like this is like crazy. And they've got pill boxes that I'd only seen previously, like my grandparents having, which is kind of more understandable given age and stuff. Um, but I think that is creeping in here a little bit more, just from anecdotally what I see. And hopefully it doesn't get to the where it was in the States, because it just seems chaotic over there. And obviously they've got different levers. They've got pharmaceutical companies and different things going on that we don't have because of the NHS, obviously. But yeah, hopefully it doesn't go that far. And as you say, that trend's getting reversed here.
I hope it is.
Yeah. No, I think it's in everyone's interest that it is. Well, apart from
Mhm.
pharmaceutical companies, obviously. I wonder then, it's quite pertinent given where we're at now. You also talk about putting staff wellbeing in the heart of healthcare delivery. Couldn't be a better time to be talking about that, and it's obviously perfect timing for right now. What do you mean about that? Are you referring to staff wellbeing as in the workers in the NHS and workers in healthcare, or is it staff wellbeing as a whole in the general population?
Okay, great question. I'm talking about how staff feel as a result of working for the NHS. I'm really proud to work for the NHS. I have done for 20 years, and I will continue to do so long as they'll have me. But my big concern is how staff are being treated at an institutional level, at a managerial level, at an administrative level, and what that is doing to their well-being. We look at some of the stats that have come out recently in a study in the BMJ last year. It was a survey that shows that suicide rates are up to 4 times the national average amongst doctors. 1 in 3
Wow.
doctors are resorting to alcohol or drugs or prescription medication just to get through their shift. And a quarter of doctors say that they have severe, debilitating mental health problems, which are mostly down to work. And I think these are just so much higher than what we see as on a population average. So why is it so high, and what can we do about it? And we've really got to look at not only how we can support doctors, but how we can reduce the strain that's being put upon them at an institutional level. And we're at a very, very interesting time right now with coronavirus and the response that has happened to that through the NHS, because it's almost as if bureaucracy have kind of stepped back and said, okay, we're not going to bother you at the moment. We're going to let you get on with your job, because they've cancelled all appraisals and revalidation. They've cancelled inspections from the Care Quality Commission. They've essentially given us what we want. We've got more staff being brought in. We've got, 700,000 volunteers coming in to help us out.
Yeah.
And whilst this is, an international tragedy, and I hope that we all manage to heal and recover from it and move forward, I think that this has been a game changer for the NHS, that politicians are actually starting to listen to us. It's not done. I mean, we've still got a quarter of doctors not working at the moment for the NHS because they're off either self-isolating or off sick. And whether that's down to lack of personal protective equipment, I don't know. But certainly we're not getting enough of that across the country for our frontline staff. So, I'm encouraged to see some of the positive things that have happened, because it's kind of revealed, what do we need to do, what don't we need to do. It turns out we didn't need to do all of these ridiculous meetings that we hold every single day for a bunch of bureaucrats to tick a few boxes. We didn't need to have these draconian measures instituted upon us by the Care Quality Mission and their aggressive inspections. We don't need to go through the nonsense of having appraisals and revalidation and all of the associated time and paperwork and resources that are used up by it. And we can reinvest all of that into supporting our health, our population health. And that's the way it should always have been, frankly.
You mentioned that there's 2 things I want to pick back up on there. So I'm just curious because, again, I don't know all that much about this area. As a GP, going back to pre-coronavirus times and the normal times, put it that way, what percentage of the time is actually taken up by bureaucracy, and what percentage of the time is taken up by things that, in your view, that you should be doing? Could you quantify it?
I could, yep. So I would say if you take my average day at work, a third of it is paperwork or administrative work. And so, if that wasn't there, then I'd be able to increase the number of patients I see by 50%.
Wow.
Every year since, I think, 2000, when did it start? Early 2000s, that we introduced appraisals and revalidation. So every year we have to accumulate 50 hours of continual professional development and reflect on it and put together all of these online forms and um, supportive evidence and documentation and everything to tick a few boxes to allow us to be appraised. And that culminates after a 3-hour meeting with an appraiser, which costs the NHS £500 a go. So, we've got 65,000 doctors. I'll let you do the maths. So it gets a little bit ridiculous there. And, it turns out that actually we don't need to do that. And we haven't done it for so many decades. Since we brought it in, there's no scientific evidence to support its use. And here we are at a time when we're needed on the front line, that they've actually said, well, yeah, you don't need to do it. And so what have we been doing all this time? Why have we had this ridiculous system in place?
So you've kind of gone to it a little bit. What kind of lasting impacts do you want to see from the positives we can take out of the reduced bureaucracy and increased kind of funding available, I suppose, to medical care? Are there kind of specific things that you want to see that have come out of this crisis that should, in your opinion, kind of flow through and kind of help improve the NHS for the better long term?
Well, I think we've got to remember that nurses and healthcare professionals and associates and doctors, on the whole, they're a pretty smart bunch, and they can figure things out, and they can work with what they've got. And that's really what has got us through this crisis so far. It hasn't been as a result of any particular directives being put in place. It's been the sheer strength and dedication of our workforce, and it really does make you feel so proud to be part of the organisation and to have such an organisation at our fingertips. In terms of the long-lasting changes that I'd like to see, well, I would like to see as many of them as possible, really. I would like to see a lot less interference. Example is I wanted to refer a patient for a certain procedure, and I had to go through an approval system, which we didn't have to do a few years ago. And once they did that, they decided that it wasn't appropriate. And so once I appealed it, and I basically had to argue with a manager who has no clinical experience whatsoever to try and explain to them why this patient needs this procedure. And they just, shrugged their shoulders and rolled their eyes and said, okay, you can do it then. And I thought, well, that's great, but why do I have to go through this? What is the point in that? I'm the doctor, this is my patient, I know what this patient needs at this moment in time, and I'm happy to defend my decision at any time. But why should I have to go through these kind of processes where I have to justify my clinical acumen to someone who is completely non-clinical?
Makes total sense. It seems ridiculous, really. I wonder as well, kind of, one of the other things, the political kind of debate that's used a lot is that there aren't enough people wanting to go into the profession, whether it be GPs or nurses or any of the kind of auxiliary type roles. Is that something that you see? And if that is the case, what can we do to fix that? Do you think? Is it, you've talked, at length there about the kind of the negative aspects of the downsides and the pressures that kind of help prevent people possibly getting into the profession. Is that the case? Is that the reason you think people are stopping and going, do I want to be part of that statistic where actually I'm going to be unhappy or whatever? Is that a big problem right now?
I think it is. Yeah, recruitment's been a big problem, as well as retention. And we've got to find a way to make it look more attractive. And year on year, it's been looking less attractive. And I say that firsthand after being a GP partner for, well, between 2007 to 2017, I worked in a very large partnership before leaving. And literally year on year, it was just getting more and more frustrating. I found ourselves just banging heads sometimes. And we've got to do the opposite. We've got to actually make it easier and make it more simple and more supportive and more attractive. So, what keeps us in the job at the moment? If you ask any healthcare professional, they'll say it's the desire to make a difference, to help and support support people at a time of need. It's not going to be a generous pay package, but then, that would be nice. It's not necessarily going to be sociable working hours, but again, that would also be nice. So, how can we really build this up and make it attractive to someone of the age of 16 to 18 who's applying to medical school, or are they going to apply to a different for a different course at university? I'm hopeful that, there's a lot of recruitment drives at the moment. You've probably seen them on TV recently for the NHS, and that's great to see. But I think they need to tell the whole truth and realize that it's not glamorous at all. It can be very tough. And what makes it easier is having that support around us centrally and throughout the organisation.
I know it was quite a long time ago now. Back in '98, you had a internship in San Francisco. I'm just curious as to if you can draw any parallels, people, as to what the healthcare system that you experience is like over there and how that compares to here. Because obviously, there's tons of documentaries on, how difficult situations can be in the States versus here. But I'm interested to know from your perspective, albeit it was quite some time ago, what you drew from that and what how it compares to here.
Yeah, so I did a 2-month elective in San Francisco General Hospital in summer '98. It's now called the Zuckerberg General Hospital. I don't know if you knew that.
Did not know that. There you go.
And it was, it didn't seem that different compared to what I experienced in hospital medicine. The junior doctors were really good fun, really dedicated, really hardworking, but they knew how to have a good time as well. And the education was excellent. But then, I was at Imperial College in London. We had a terrific education there. The style of education was, I found, a bit more supportive towards the doctor, whereas when I was in London, they were kind of, saying, well, here's the information, and this is how you put it together, and we're going to have a really, really difficult test at the end. So I didn't find that part to be particularly enjoyable when I was in med school, but it seemed as if it was actually rather similar in the US at the time. Obviously, I didn't get involved in the financial side and how health insurance works over there. I didn't have any interest in that side of things, but fully appreciate how different it is over there with Medicare and Medicaid.
Just before we come on to your podcast, I'm really interested to talk about. I wonder as well. So I'm trying to think where my train of thought was going there. Completely lost
I do
train
this
of
all
thought.
the time, don't worry.
Very unusual for me. So we will go on to talk about your podcast whilst I have to rethink what I was trying to ask you. So you've got this podcast called Enduring Health. What's it all about? Where can people listen to it, and kind of what sort of what will they take away from listening?
Okay, so Enduring Health has been on for about 18 months now, and it's available on all podcast providers pretty much. So iTunes, or Apple Podcasts it's called nowadays, Spotify, Google Play, Podbean, Stitcher, whatever you've got. And we talk about natural ways to support health. We have an interview format. I always bring on guests to talk about different things, bring their experience to the table. And we basically have a conversation and see if there's anything that we can create between us, or if they've got a great story or they found some really interesting research. We only have credible guests on, so there's not going to be some sort of new age guru or anything like that. It's I think it's a great podcast personally, but I'm a bit biased. So we've done, I think, about 36 episodes now. Wow. It's going well. We've been on the bestsellers list for alternative health for the last few months, and tune in. I hope you enjoy it.
What kind of what have you learned from there that you wouldn't necessarily have known otherwise? What kind of interesting stuff have you taken from your guests that, as I say, without the podcast, maybe you wouldn't know?
Well, yeah, that's a great question, because doing a podcast, I'm sure you'll find this, is that it's an opportunity to speak with people who, you really, whose work you just really admire and want to learn from. And it's great to be able to just get in touch with them and speak to them and ask them anything you want for a period of 30 to 60 minutes. I had Professor Tim Noakes on recently, who talked about, I don't know if you know him, he's a South African doctor who was challenged by the authorities about his approach towards diet. And he was actually completely vindicated after a huge court case. And just asking him absolutely anything about his approaches towards diet, towards lifestyle, and what we can do to really support our own health at a constitutional level. It was fascinating. We had Dr. Aseem Malhotra talking about the dark side of medicine, specifically of medical science and scientific literature, which was really interesting. Malcolm Kendrick talked about cholesterol and how it's completely unrelated to heart disease. I thought, oh, hang on, that's a little bit off peak. Let's talk about that. And it presented so much proven scientific literature that supports his case, and that is now very, very slowly being accepted. So yeah, I like to get on pioneers and also movers and shakers and people who have really thought out their subject matter and they know what they're talking about. And ultimately, it's a really enjoyable experience to talk to these people.
Does it give you and shape you as well? So when you hear different, you talked about the cholesterol piece there with the link to heart disease or lack thereof. Does that kind of then further you and go, actually, I want to read more into this, and like you maybe change your approach on a practical level in the kind of surgery as well?
Yes, and also I hope it furthers the interest of our listeners, and they actually go and just look into themselves. I don't want anyone to listen to my podcast and just take every single word for it as gospel. It's important that we do our own research and look into things all the time. There was as we talked about earlier, there was a massive push about going on a vegan diet, but I think very few people, when they heard about it, actually looked at the scientific evidence that supposedly was out there. But yes, I've learned a tremendous amount from my guests, and I've really, really enjoyed speaking to them. And what's also great is that we build a relationship, and got friendships as a result. And that's always a wonderful thing.
Without a doubt. I've now remembered the question that I was stumbling upon, which is super
Okay.
rare for me. Which is a difficult question, but it's also something that intrigues me, which is often as a doctor, I'm sure, of course you have to give across very difficult information, and you've got to kind of be well versed, and I'm sure it comes with a lot of experience as to how to deliver information in a professional manner, which is sometimes heartbreaking and very challenging. So that's one thing. I didn't know how that came to how that kind of situation comes to be. And then the second part of that question is, how do you deal with the disconnect? Because obviously you can't take home at night or in your life. I know you're supposed to be on holiday right now. Unfortunately, you stopped doing that for obvious reasons. But how do you switch off? Because I think people in other industries that clearly aren't as quote unquote important as healthcare have that as a major problem, which ironically you obviously see as stress, which is, how do I switch off from this world where there's so much going on? And obviously as doctors, you've had that for many, many years and in a much tougher environment. So I think listeners and viewers would be interested to know what tactics you use of your 20 odd years experience to switch off and also remain professional at the right points.
Okay, great question, Charles. No pressure. I don't claim to have all the answers, just to start off with that. What I do often say is that no matter what we do in our lives, professionally or personally, every day has the potential to bring stress into our lives. So similarly, every day we've got to do something to help release that stress, whatever that might be. Now, the best stress relievers I find are things that you enjoy doing, that make you feel present, centered, and grounded, and just totally immersed in the moment, and that are ideally, preferably healthy. So different things for different people. We could go to the gym if we weren't on lockdown, but anything like playing a musical instrument, doing something creative, lifting weights, going for a run, yoga, meditation, Pilates, Tai Chi, different things for different people, whatever really resonates with you as an individual. Personally, for me, I love meditation and I love playing music. I do enjoy reading, but I think what's important is recognizing when you're starting to feel stressed. And that's something that I've struggled with. I don't always catch myself feeling stressed until suddenly it just shows up all of a sudden. And that can be avoided just by having those sort of little daily releases where you can just relieve some of the pressure on yourself, and just reflect on actually a lot of things went well that day, and congratulate yourself and make sure that you're ready and set up for the next day. So yes, I think that's a really, really important thing that we all could benefit from doing. I did have a patient once I often talk about who when I asked him that question. What single activity do you love doing more than anything else that makes you feel at peace? And he said fishing. And so I said, okay, I want you to go fishing every day for the next week for 1 hour. And he did. And when he came back, he was in a completely different state. He had a lot of previous problems with stress, and he was been feeling a bit anxious and depressed at times. He just felt so much better in himself, and you could just see that tension had lifted from his face. And so I said, well, this is great. You need to keep doing it, though. You've got to sustain it. And you will find that it's easy to go through a period of time where you stop doing it and you'll start to feel the stress coming back. So yeah, just finding a way to let go is an absolutely essential part of anything we do, not just being a doctor.
I think that's a really fantastic piece of advice, and a great kind of really pertinent right now, where people are kind of feeling locked in and enclosed, and finding that kind of momentary, whether it's an hour or so of getting out of the house, going for a run, meditating, painting, reading, whatever it might be, I think is so important. I think also, sorry.
Well, I was going to say that yes, we're in this lockdown at the moment. I did see something interesting on social media the other day that someone said it's important to remember that you're not stuck at home, you're safe at home, and the wording we use is really, really important to help us understand that. And the other thing that I think our government perhaps ought to start pressing is, let's stop calling it social distancing, social isolation. We need to call it what it is, and that is physical distancing. We can still be social. You and I being social right now. We can still talk to our neighbours across the street if we want to. We can still engage with the people in our household. And social connection is a very key part of health. It's very important that we manage to maintain our relationships with others, family, friends, community, during this difficult time. So hopefully that will give some people something to think about, saying, actually, let's just focus on making sure that we're physically kept apart from other people. And if we're out, then it's got to be a safe 2 meter distance, as I'm sure everyone knows. But it doesn't mean we can't be social. We can still, have a group chat on FaceTime or Zoom or Skype, whatever you want to do, and catch up with your friends. And I think it's really important to do that on a regular basis.
So I think two good takeaways there, which is physical distancing, I think, is a much more appropriate name, as you say, and safe at home rather than what I said, which is stuck at home. But I'm with my parents, so maybe that's why. But no, you're dead right. Thank you so much for your time, particularly during this time at the moment as well, and when you should actually be on holiday. So hopefully, I mean, I'm no Sunny Beach, if that's where you were going. So apologies for that, but hopefully I've given you some mental stimulation, and I'm certainly sure that the listeners and viewers will really thank you for your insights and time today. So thank you so much.
You're very welcome, Charles. Great to talk to you, and wish you all the best with the podcast.